Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, as I continue my look at some of the politics which caught my attention in 2022, but will have implications for the future, I'm going to take a little look at the sticky situation that Conservatives find themselves in. And I don't just mean the Conservative Party front for UKIP that we have in the UK, but Conservatives around the world. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So as a message of hope as we look ahead to the future, I know I'm usually the prophet of doom, really miserable in these videos, but this one is actually hopeful for the future. If you're patient, it's not just around the corner. I published a video recently that discussed the way in which demographic changes, which have generally suited the Tories in Britain, could act against them over the next generation. So far, the Conservatives have benefited from poor house building programmes when they're in government. That's all entirely deliberate, and young graduates end up having to move to the cities for work. It means that you end up with a load of constituencies loaded up with older homeowners, just the sort of people who vote Conservative, and all the people who will generally vote Labour just get loaded up into the cities. Like, okay, Labour can have those seats, they'll win massive majorities, but not that many seats. But their squeeze on incomes is likely to drive these graduates away from the cities over the next decade or so, into commuter belts, which are solid Tory areas right now. So that'll make it tricky for the Conservatives to retain. But that is a specific issue with Conservatives in this country. I mean, maybe there's an element of that in others, I don't know. But I've seen no end of articles about the general problem that Conservatives face over the next generation around the world, not just specifically in the UK. And I was reading another one today that had some graphs that just showed it so perfectly. See, for quite a long time now, and I mean a couple of centuries at least, it has been the political wisdom that people, when they're young, they're idealistic, full of empathy for others, and they tend to support progressive politics. Now, this has never done the Conservatives much harm, because in the old days, the young weren't eligible to vote because they weren't property owners. And now that they are eligible to vote, they basically don't bother doing so. So it's not an issue that young people are full of principles that are totally at odds with the Conservatives. But as people get older, they start to consider that maybe Conservative policies are the better option for them. They've built up a lifetime of cynicism. I'm sure sociologists will be attuned with the myriad of complex reasons why it happens. But people tend more towards Conservative politics as they age. Now, of course, a generalisation. Some people don't. In fact, some people become more progressive as their experience gives them the wisdom to see the harm in Conservative politics. But by and large, the older you get, the more likely you are to vote Conservative. And because older people vote in such disproportionately large numbers, that skews even societies that are not really right-wing towards right-wing governments. The problem is particularly pronounced in countries like the UK or the USA, where first past the post is used rather than a representative form of elections. But something is changing. See, these graphs that I was referring to, show for both the UK and the US that previous generations have become more conservatives as they become older, just as we accept the political reality that as you get older, you're not likely to be conservative when you're younger. As you get older, you will be. But for millennials, it's very different. It's not just a little bit different either. Look at this. This is a graph that says when millennials become the older, cantankerous, large pool of voters, the Conservatives are in for a very bad time. In fact, they're just going to lose. You look at a graph like this and you think, this is oblivion. The Generation X, entering that sort of age of voting addicts, looks to be the last which will vote Conservative in anything like significant numbers. I'm sure there's lots of reasons for this. I think some are fairly obvious. Previous generations of the middle classes would work through their youth, get onto the housing ladder, get ahead of the game in middle age, retire as homeowners, maybe with some investments coming in to give them a comfortable old age. This is no longer the case. Millennials struggle to get onto the housing ladder. That means they are paying much more for accommodation because even in their 30s and 40s, they're more likely to be paying rent rather than a mortgage repayment. And the thing about rent is it keeps going up. at least in line with inflation. After you've had a mortgage for even 10 years, the actual repayment, even if like some people will kick the hell out of their income to get the maximum possible mortgage, but even 10 years later, unless your income has fallen badly with inflation, the repayment will be fairly low compared to your income. Not rent. That just keeps going up and up. And the Conservatives have never represented the interests of their country or its people in any part of the world. Only ever the ultra wealthy. That's who they support, the ultra wealthy. So the way they won power in an age of universal suffrage was by bribing susceptible groups of voters with trinkets and baubles. But they stopped doing so. They lost sight of what allowed them to win elections. Now, it's easily done because their politics is of reducing state management of the country and its population, but it has bitten them on the arse good and hard, or is about to anyway. Millennials are also the first generation really coming to terms with the consequences of climate change. Conservatives do themselves no favours by continued support for the policies that landed us in this mess. Some canny Conservatives realise that they have to modernise their approach to the environment, but they tend to be shouted and, more importantly, voted down by those too dumb to understand and getting some nice little backhanders from the oil industry. There may even be something in the fact that millennials did not have to get all their news from established outlets. Social media, it's a double-edged sword. It allows disinformation merchants to bombard people with the same lies but appearing to be from multiple sources to add validity. But it also allows more well-meaning people to challenge the establishment narrative. And I would also argue that capitalism is eating itself right now. Conservatives kept feeding the beast for decades. They just got hungrier and hungrier. In more literal terms, we remove the metaphors. What's actually happened is that wealth has just drifted upwards at quite a rate. Almost all of it is now held by a small number of incredibly wealthy individuals and corporations. This was not the case a few generations ago. And there's no natural equilibrium in the system. There's no trickle down. We know that doesn't work. So the drift keeps going up. This was not a political problem when ordinary people still enjoyed a rising standard of living. Because even though they were sort of getting a more and more raw deal, the standard of living with modernisation kept going up. But that is now no longer the case. It's gone down now. In the UK, the cost of living crisis really came to a head in 2022. And the government have decided to meet this on by beating people down with the refusal to lift vital key workers out of poverty. They're drawing battle lines with workers, and they're going to carry on next year. In the medium and long term, even if they win, all this is going to do is hasten the end of unchecked capitalism. Because the losing side isn't going to go, oh, you've convinced us. No, they'll just realise they were beaten by a system that's not in their favour. They will want the system changing. The beast is laid bare. The next generation of active voters is not benefiting from Conservative policies. And this may be allowing them to retain empathy, maybe, with those suffering from the effects of our economic model. Again, a common trick of the Conservatives is to portion out society, to tell the large group of voters that these other ones are sponging, these other ones are the problem. But no, these people retain empathy because they share in that suffering. We know that life expectancy among some groups in both the UK and the US has actually been going down recently. Not just levelled off, but actively going down as the standard of living over the past decade has been reduced. Poverty has increased, people have become less healthy. Conservatives don't necessarily mind this in isolation. If people don't live as long and they're into retirement where they're not economically active, great. But their biggest quandary is always that they need the older generation to vote them into power. But retirees are a problem for their economic ideology because they don't like social support. They do not like social support structures, at least not ones that the state needs to manage. It was so much easier in the good old days when only property owners could vote. It was hardly any of them. Make sure they're all right, and that was it. But what these graphs shows is that the days of the Conservatives, as we know them, is over. I don't actually think they'll face political oblivion. It is possible. Things do change. But there's too much money, self-interest behind them. But what is clear is that the recent lurch to the right that we've experienced recently on both sides of the Atlantic, other countries around the world as well, will not be possible in another 20 years' time. In fact, the consequences of Conservative policy will become even more apparent, even crueler over the next couple of decades. I do not expect Generation Z to go back to the previous trend of becoming Conservative as they age. I don't think Millennials are just like an aberration. It's part of the reason why I say, if we could have just beaten Brexit off in 2016, the issue would not crop up again. That would be it. It was close enough in 2016, and the political extremists threw everything at it. Everything. And they only just got over the line. They'd have never survived a confirmatory referendum, and they would never have won under any circumstances just a few years later. 2016 was their one and only shot, and they knew it, and we failed to defend against it. But what is going to emerge over the next generation is a majority of voters, and when I say voters, I mean people who actually vote, not just are eligible to vote, who are going to be quite unlike the current majority. Politics is going to change out of all recognition. It's just a shame that it is coming too late for some things, because much of the damage caused is permanent, particularly to the environment. But the current crowd of climate deniers and insular xenophobic multimillionaires are about to find themselves increasingly irrelevant. Put it this way, I think the younger generation trying to cash in on the current politics are not going to be doing so for the rest of their lives. We're not going to be hearing from an elderly Darren Grimes or Sophie Corcoran on GBBs or any other outlet, because the punters currently sustaining them are going to be gone. And these graphs show they won't be replaced by the next generation. And in the UK, we are counting down the last year or two of the Tories. With luck, Labour will be in power for at least 10 years, giving another decade for the new generation to get turned onto politics, start voting in larger numbers, so that the manifesto promises needed in 10 years should be very much more progressive than it is now. And you think, okay, this is the way it could go. You look at these graphs and you go, no, this is the way it's going to go. This is actually what's going to happen. What we need now is another Bob Dylan to narrate this, because the times they are changing. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.